We are recording this podcast on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We wish to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend our respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening.
Hello and welcome to Novel Feelings, where two psychologists take a deep dive into your favorite books. I'm Priscilla.
And I'm Elise, and welcome back to another author interview. Today we have a special interview lined up with author Margo Candela. So we are going to be talking about Margo's 2022 release, The Neapolitan Sisters, today. We had such a lovely chat with Margo and took a really deep dive into some of the characters in her book. But yeah, hopefully you read the book, come back and jump in for the spoilers section, because there is some tea that is spilled about these characters, just saying.
Absolutely. Let us start by telling you a bit about Margo, though. Margo Candela was born and raised in Los Angeles and began her writing career when she joined Glendale Community College's student newspaper. She transferred to San Francisco State University as a journalism major and upon graduation began writing for websites and magazines before writing her first two novels, Underneath It All and Life Over Easy. She returned to Los Angeles to raise her son and wrote More Than This and Goodbye to All That. The Neapolitan Sisters is her fifth novel and her first after a decade-long hiatus from writing. She now lives in San Francisco.
And a little bit more about the book. So, growing up with a kind but alcoholic father and a suspicious, passive-aggressive mother, three sisters each developed their own ways of coping. Dulcina had her art and her drugs and alcohol, Claudia plunged into her studies and fled to Princeton, and Maritza watched one Disney movie after another in between devouring romance novels. Now all grown up, the sisters are reunited at last for Maritza's dream wedding, but they are no less different than they were growing up. Maritza is a princess bridezilla, Claudia is the family fixer, and Dulcina, Dooley, is finally sober. With all three sisters back in their East LA home, each begins to take steps to come to terms with each other, their parents, and the secrets from their shared past. While their lives may have taken different paths, they are still sisters at heart.
It's a fascinating book, and I always love a book about sister relationships. Can relate sometimes.
And a real character-driven novel as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Before we get started on our interview, here's our usual disclaimers. We are trained psychologists, but this podcast should not be taken as direct therapeutic advice. Please consult a professional for more specific and tailored advice. The first half of this interview is spoiler-free, but the second half contains minor and major spoilers for the Neapolitan Sisters as we dig into the mental health content and what happens in the book. Also, we'll just flag that this interview has been edited for length.
Major spoiler warning coming up for the second half of the episode. And just a couple of quick content notes. So today we are talking about topics such as disordered eating, anxiety and control, abusive parents, alcohol and drug use, trauma and childhood abuse, racism and misogyny, fat shaming and weight stigma.
Now let's get started on the interview.
So, Margo, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you're recording from San Francisco. How are things on the other side of the world?
San Francisco is a beautiful city, very beautiful. I mean, it has it's facing some serious challenges right now, which sometimes make it hard to live here, but I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. I honestly am very grateful and very, very happy to be here. It's a very creative city.
I'm sure, and I've never been, but I've heard good things. And we're, of course, recording from Australia. Have you ever been over here before?
Not yet, but if you have a guest room.
I have recommendations to places to visit. So if you ever decide to, please reach out.
I will.
Well, congratulations on the publication of The Neapolitan Sisters in 2022. How has your writing and storytelling evolved since you first became an author?
It's definitely matured, and I am in a much different place than I was with my first book, which came out in 2007. I now am in a very fortunate place where I am my own woman as well as my own writer. So I have no one to answer to except for my editor or whoever I'm working with, but I'm writing from a place of freedom and not giving any F's. Honestly, my writing has really changed. There's still a lot of humor in it, but I'm much more comfortable taking on darker, more complicated subjects without hiding behind humor. And I think that has to do a lot with being a lot older and being happily divorced. That was a huge, huge relief to just kind of be able to move on from that, or in the process of moving on from that, and refocus on my creative life.
And you spoke then just about complexity and how feeling more comfortable diving into those deeper topics and complicated characters and narratives. And the Neapolitan Sisters, of course, weaves together the stories of three quite complex characters who all have such a unique voice, Claudia, Maritza, and Dooley. Can you tell us about how you came up with their characters?
I love things in threes. Threes make sense to me, three sections, beginning, middle, and end. And when it came to this story, it was natural for me to have three sisters, because three sisters is a lot of sisters, and they can each go in their own directions, but they're still closely bonded. So, and they were born very close, like one right after another after another. So it was a natural choice for me to write about three sisters. And then I love to write in first person, which just comes naturally to me. And each of them had their own distinct voice. And as I wrote the first draft and then went through it again, it became a lot more clearer to me who spoke and what kind of tempo, who used what kind of words. And they each have their own take on their childhood, and they express it in different ways. And it was a fun process, honestly. And it was very revealing to me as a person while I was writing to it, what I discovered about them as I wrote them, which made me reflect on my own, like, how do I view this? And sometimes I had to you have to take yourself out of it, because it's not my story. It's their story. So I had to, like, for instance, with Maritza, you said complicated, I would say difficult, right? But she is a difficult character. And I had to find out why she was so difficult without trying to fix her. And letting her be the character she needed to be. And that's how I found my compassion for her, because as I've said, I won't go out to lunch with her. I would never go out to lunch with her, but I have her back. I really do have her back. I have a lot of compassion for Maritza as a character, and as what some people are Maritzas. So they're difficult people, and I have compassion for them, but I won't put up with their crap.
Yeah.
So writing, all of those things came together, and I think this book could only have happened at this point in my life. There was no way I could have written it 10 years ago. No way.
Which really, speaks to how you have, of course, evolved as a writer, and your own perspective evolving too, I imagine.
I would hope so. You have to evolve. And I think that's part of the human process, that some people are content to stay where they are, but I have taken a really hard look at myself as a woman, a mother, and as a writer. And I hope to just fulfill those and inhabit those parts of myself in a deeper, more honest way.
I would say three sisters is a lot of sisters. I'm one of two, and I can't imagine having to, share a bed with my sister my whole childhood. That would be a lot.
It's not that uncommon in Latino families to cram. I was recently, a friend offered me a ride home from where we were hanging out, and she said she had her two kids in the back with car seats, and she said it's going to be kind of tight. And I told her, you want to know how many kids my parents crammed into the backseat of the Crown Victoria? It's just like, this is nothing. This is luxurious. I think I grew up as one of four sisters and with a brother. So I was from a big family, and there wasn't a lot of privacy growing up, definitely. And I think that's something the sisters now not necessarily take for granted, but are more aware of important privacy is. And privacy and secrets are two different things. That's what I've taught my son. The sisters have secrets, maybe not privacy.
So the novel covers a lot of intersectional themes, some of which we've already spoken about, including the sisters' experiences as Latinas, as women, navigating family and careers and their intimate relationships. Were you specifically hoping to examine or challenge any particular stereotypes?
All of them.
Yeah.
All of them. Honestly, it was... there's a 10-year gap between the Neapolitan Sisters and my last book, Goodbye to All That. I lived a lifetime in those 10 years. And when I decided I was ready, not only was ready, but wanted to pursue getting something published again, which I had no idea if it would happen or not, because I was surprised it happened the first time, honestly. I knew I was in a place where I had to do it with a lot of courage. And this book really was for me an act of bravery. It is not an easy book. It makes some people very, very uncomfortable, because I am not writing a very feel-good, magical realism, the kind of book that people are okay with Latinas writing. It's a very blunt book. It deals with sex in a way that's very singular to a woman's pleasure. And it also kind of calls out the whole Mexican mommy trope that, your mother is just, a Mexican mother is nurturing and will feed you and will jump in front of the car for you. This mother is not that kind of mother. And that's made people uncomfortable. Also, the sex has made people uncomfortable. And the cussing, which... I'm trying hard not to do, but...
We just have to be mindful to mark it as explicit so nobody's listening with, small children. They're not comfortable hearing certain words.
I'll keep it a hard PG-13. How about that?
Excellent. Yeah, it's good.
The book isn't.
I'm just going to skip ahead to a question as I think it's relevant here. But, you mentioned some backlash and, all authors are, of course, subject to criticisms of their work. It's part of the deal. But how do you personally respond to criticism? And do you ever feel that some of the criticism you receive might be unfair or misses the point?
I think I'm a reader myself, and my job, and I do consider this a job, as well as a calling, is to give a reader an entertaining, good story. First and foremost, I write for the reader. I don't write for myself. And I understood with the Neapolitan Sisters that this was not going to be the kind of book that everyone likes. I understand that completely, and I totally get it, because there are books I don't like, right? And but this one was opening up the subjects and opening me up to being wondered about or questioned. What I have found, the ones I have gotten upset with, where I've been told that I was stereotyping. I, as a Latina, was stereotyping Latinas, and I was being, the reviewers were not Latina who were telling me this. So they were calling me a stereotype. I had somebody say that if I wasn't Latina, I would be canceled, which is just, here's my PG-13 bullshit.
Yeah.
And I think it's because the book is so blunt and so unapologetic, and so open and vulnerable that it does make people very, very uncomfortable. And I'm okay with that. And I think that's more that they need to look at as to why they're uncomfortable. They don't have to like the book. I'm totally okay with that. As a consumer myself, you don't have to like everything. But to take it so personally, that means, for me, as somebody, I'm not not a therapist or whatever. Sociology was more my game. Their reaction to me speaks of their issue. So I've had to I stopped reading reviews. I am very, very proud of this book. I do not apologize for anything in it. But I do understand how it does make people uncomfortable. And I also, I think, have enough empathy to be okay with that. People deserve to be uncomfortable if they are uncomfortable. But when they start getting personal, I think that's when they cross a line.
Yeah. And I suppose that comment around your characters being stereotypes. We've just spoken about how you were trying to actively dismantle and examine some of these stereotypes too. So it's clear to me that that was something that you were, not purposefully doing, like writing a stereotype or anything like that.
I think it was more that I didn't write the book that they were expecting a Latina to write. And in that, they were so uncomfortable with my depiction of, I think, very plausible, they're fictional characters, but very plausible Latina women that I know and I have met, right? Mm-hmm. And since I wasn't leaning into the hot chichi mama bullshit kind of Latina character, they tried to call me on that and told me, since I didn't write the stereotype, they then accused me of stereotyping Latinas. So it's you can't win for losing. It's not the book for them. I'm happy to have a deeper, longer, more intellectual conversation about this. But no, actually, oh no, I'm not. I just, you don't like the book. We can all move on.
Yeah.
It's not, I would love people to enjoy reading the book, definitely. But I do respect a person not wanting to read the book beyond the first chapter. And then I start the book with Maritza. So yeah, I pretty much set myself up.
Yeah.
It's interesting because Priscilla and I are both organizing our own weddings at the moment.
Oh,
so
my condolences and congratulations.
Thank you. Just a parallel that was happening there.
Yeah.
So stressful.
Yeah.
You couldn't pay me to get married again or have a wedding again. You couldn't pay me, honestly. It is, it's just, families go nuts. And I think Maritza is a prime example of somebody who has gone nuts for a wedding in her whole life. It's in the span of a month, but her whole life now has begun to focus on the wedding and being a bride. And that is not an uncommon thing to happen. People get fixated on the actual event and kind of lose sight of, well, what does it really mean? What does it really mean? Why are you doing it? So she never asks herself that question.
Yeah, I do find her fixation with being a bride really interesting, but we'll keep that conversation for the spoiler part of this episode. So why did you choose to set the book in the early 2000s?
Well, and I wrote the first draft around this time. And I honestly don't know where the story came from, because usually stories occur to me while I am doing something else. Like I have a long walk commute from one part of San Francisco to another part of San Francisco. And I thought of a whole novel that way. I don't know where the story initially came from, other than it came to me with a beginning, middle, and end. And I set it in 2003 because that's around the time that I wrote the first draft. And when Toni Kirkpatrick over at Alcove acquired the book, she did say, well, would you consider moving it up to, 2021 or 20, somewhere, or no, like 2019, 2020. And I told her no. I told her I didn't want to deal with the political climate that was occurring in the States at then. There's no way you could have avoided it in a book set in 2019. I didn't want to deal with social media either. I wanted them, because just imagine how much more obnoxious Maritza would be if she had Instagram.
Oh my God.
It would be scary. And I wanted them to have them to be a plausible reason for them to not be, even though they had cell phones, for them to not be so constantly connected, and that they could have their own private lives and keep their lives private, especially Claudia and Ethan. And because Ethan is basically a movie star. And at that time you had just the magazines, and there was really little internet that hadn't blown up yet. The gossip, the whole machine that it's turned into. So I told her it just didn't make sense for me to move it up. It would have changed the scope of the story. But I did tone down some of the more very 2003 references. But I stand by setting it there. I think it's interesting to revisit the near past. I did have to do a lot of research to remember things, but I'm glad I said it in 2003. I was sick of 2020, honestly.
Yeah.
That's when I was revising it. I was just sick
you
of
would
it.
have had to think about COVID and all of this narrative things that would have changed the whole dynamic.
That's a different book for a different writer, not for me. To me, it's just, and it's an interesting time, 2003. There was a lot going on. Things were kind of in flux. So 2003 worked.
Yeah, that does make sense. And it's a very a simpler time in some ways, arguably.
It really was. The more I think about it, that's why they were able to focus on what they were focusing on without having to deal with outside forces. So,
Absolutely.
you want them to be. Well, Maritza was always going to be self-absorbed, but the other sisters were a little bit more tuned in and aware of what was going on around them. And I just, like I said, I didn't want the distraction of social media.
Makes sense. We're starting to approach our spoiler question section, but we do have one final question before we start the spoilers, which is something we ask all of our interviewees. Do you have any particular authors or books that you would like to recommend to our listeners? They might be covering similar topics or similar themes, or might just be others that you'd like to give a shout out to.
Well, I have to say, one of, how you have your heroes, right? The Ann Tyler, for me, is a writer who I would never ever compare myself to her, but as a reader, her books have a special place in my heart because she writes about regular people who have very small lives in such a compassionate, beautiful, illuminating way. And I think from her, I've taken that you can write a whole story about somebody who doesn't have to be an extra special person. They can just be someone who lives down the street, and their lives are just as rich as somebody who's having all sorts of adventures. And she's a beautiful writer. So for me, her books are always, they give me joy and they give me comfort. They've made me cry. And she really is my hero as a writer. So if you're looking for just a stories about people, I think she's someone to check out.
Yeah, wonderful. Shall we move on to the spoiler questions now?
Let's do it. Let's start our spoiler section.
Hi, I'm Michael.
I'm Barbara.
And I'm Lauren.
We are the hosts of Badass Literature Society, a book review podcast where we take book recommendations from listeners like you, read them, and then discuss them on our show.
Join us once a month as we dive into the books you picked and talk about them.
And don't miss our bonus episodes covering all sorts of random bookish topics that come out in between reviews.
Don't worry, if you want to read one of the books, the first part of each episode is designated spoiler-free, so you can listen and see if you'd like to read it, and then come back and listen to the rest later.
You can find Badass Literature Society on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Podcasts, and anywhere else you like to listen.
Now, back to the show.
I wanted to ask about control, basically. So this was something that came to mind as I was reading the book, was how each of our three main characters really does seem to struggle with control in their own unique ways. So, of course, we have Claudia being the fixer of the family, really looking out for her own needs. Maritza with her bridezilla tendencies, and Dooley almost struggling in the opposite way, somewhat being out of control at times with her relationship with alcohol and drugs, at least in the past before the novel begins. How do you imagine that the sisters' early trauma that we learn about as the book unfolds shaped their relationship with control?
Well, I think it had everything to do with it. And it also had to do, even before that, with being daughters of a neglectful parent, the father, even though he's very loving, he's just not checked in, and a abusive mother. And I think those factors had already set them up for having issues. And then there was the other abuse they suffered in silence, and they themselves have never really acknowledged. I mean, it's touched on, but they don't really talk about it. So I think, I know you as therapists, you probably see people manifest trauma in all sorts of ways, and they cope with it in different ways. And I think these three sisters have manifested it in their own unique way, and also have chosen to try and control it in other, Claudia by always having it together, by thinking 2 steps ahead of everyone. Maritza by not progressing, by staying at a certain emotional age, and Dooley by being the problem daughter, the one that obviously has problems, but let's not discuss or even consider why she has problems or acknowledge why she has problems. She's just a problem. So that for me as a writer was very interesting to, the aftermath of what happens without being very obvious or explaining it too much, and letting the reader, trusting the reader to be able to understand what wasn't being said, especially by Maritza.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of people develop, I suppose, a relationship with control as an unintentional coping strategy. It's not something people actively do. It almost becomes part of their personalities and their ways of relating to other people, is how they choose to take control of the situation. But none of it was something that they chose to do. No one chooses to have that particular relationship with control.
And I think it's one of Claudia's biggest issues, that she knows she has to be in control. Mm-hmm. And she's finally in a place in life or with someone who she knows she can't control and doesn't want to control and doesn't need her to control him, because he's just open and honest with her and upfront with her. And she doesn't understand that. She doesn't understand a true give and take. She understands giving and pulling back when someone takes too much. And she has been put in a parental role by her parents, which I think really screws kids up. It has long-term damage. It really is one of the worst things. And I'm speaking as a parent. To not allow your child to be a child and to be able to see you as someone like, you are the parent, you are in charge, I can trust you. They didn't have that. They had Claudia. So Claudia, at the end of the book, she says she just wants to be a sister to her sisters. That's what she wants, because she's going to be someone's mother. And she understands the tremendous, tremendous responsibility that comes with that. And now she knows she doesn't have to do it by herself because she has Ethan.
And maybe has some more vulnerability as well.
I think I remember I'm a fan of therapy, which also is it's much more common now in the Latino community. When I started, it was something like, for instance, you can go to confession, but don't even think about going to therapy. I mean, it really makes people uncomfortable. It's like you're telling tales out of school. I remember when my beloved therapist who retired said to me, we were talking about vulnerability. Like, do you allow yourself to feel vulnerable? And I looked at her and I said, I don't know what that means. And I had to go home and look the word up. And then I came back the next session and I said, no, no, not for me. And it's one of those things, I think, depending on where you are in life, that there are some times where it's not safe to be vulnerable. It's very, very scary.
Well, people are going to take advantage of you for being vulnerable. It makes sense that you're going to be putting up those walls.
And the sisters have to certain extents. I think at this time in the book, when Dooley is coming home, I think, for as screwed up and as chaotic as her life was, she is probably the most centered and balanced of the three sisters. She is open and aware and probably the healthiest. There is, for me as the writer, there was some thought, well, is she going to replace sex for drugs and alcohol? And I think that was a question I had in my own mind, and I was willing to not spell it out. And if a reader asks me, I said, I, as a writer, was kind of wondering that myself. And I don't want to give a definitive answer because I honestly don't know.
Well, I suppose part of becoming sober would have involved a lot of reflection on her part, and that might have helped. That probably helped with her becoming the most centered and balanced of the sisters as well. I was also going to say I really enjoyed, because we have the 3 first-person point of views, I really enjoyed how it highlights this idea that even when siblings have the same set of parents, you never really have the same parents because your relationships are so different, as individuals. And so, you can see one sister might see the dad as one way and another would see him a different way and have a completely different experience. And that really came through, I think, in the book.
For me, it was very important that each sister had their own individual relationship with their parents, who are largely in the background. They are not really active in the book. And that was a choice on my part because they are not the main characters. They had their time to do what they should have done and they didn't do it. So they don't get, they don't get credit. And that's why when it came to how the sisters refer to them, Maritza calls her daddy, right? And her mom either refers to her mom as my mother or mama. Claudia refers to them as my father, like mom and dad, because she can't, out of respect, she can't use their names. Because even she has a line that she won't cross. And then Dooley refers to them as our mother, our father. So to me, that, as I was writing, that helped me get into the mindset of how each sister not only views their parents, but also views how they were parented by them.
As you mentioned before, there were a few plot points that you've left as mysteries for the readers. For example, we never found out what happened in Maritza's first marriage. Why did you decide not to disclose this particular piece of information? And is there anything you can share with us about what happened?
I think when I went back to revise that chapter, where she does, I think that's probably the most introspection and the most thought she's given to her marriage and the way she refers to him as that person that she's ever had. And definitely she's never acknowledged what went on. When I was in conversations with Tony, my editor, she wanted to know. She's like, as a reader, I really want to know, but as an editor, I respect your decision not to write it. So I went ahead and I wrote a whole explanation as to what he did and what happened and why she left. And I sat back and then I just hit the backspace key it was a big chunk of text because I realized Maritza would never have that insightfulness to be able to acknowledge what this person did to her. What I will say, though, is that if she got married the summer she turned 18, and this man had obviously been, and who was maybe around twice her age, as Claudia says, he had been sniffing around her for quite some time. So he was definitely grooming her. It was completely inappropriate that they didn't stop the wedding. They couldn't stop the wedding. It was, Maritza was dead set on getting married before, at a younger age than Princess Diana. That was her fixation at that time. I think that's one of the things that happens in communities or in families that aren't able to acknowledge past mistakes, past trauma, a bad parenting. And Maritza got married to someone who had no business being in her life. And she had the wherewithal, though, to walk out on him when and I do, as a writer and a person, even though she's fictional, I do give her credit for that, for not allowing, wanting to save face. She left and she did what was right for her. And then she let Claudia, of course, clean up her mess.
Yeah. I did wonder if to Maritza, getting married is a form of control as well, because it means getting out of the house and, having the opportunity to realize her vision of a perfect life. Perhaps that, it feels to me like that contributed to her getting, being so insistent on getting married to Agostino despite his flaws. And perhaps why she got married so young as well, in addition to grooming that probably was going on.
Well, she thought she would have her own house, and it would be exactly how she wanted it to be. She would have, she was a big reader of romance novels, and so she thought it would be, she would have a version of that kind of life. And then she moved into this man's house, and he wouldn't even let her change the hand towels in the guest room from what his mother had. So she realized pretty quickly, and the only way she would have realized is if she would have married him, because she wasn't obviously going to date him. She was dead set on getting married. And the reason she's dead set on getting married again so quickly is because she's turning 30 and she's determined. I mean, she has these arbitrary kind of like, I have to do this by this age. And for her, marriage seems to be a way of actualizing her worth, or, how attractive she is, and achieving something, because I don't think she thinks her family, they don't understand her job, and she's very, very good at her job, but they don't understand it because it's not glamorous like Claudia's, job. So what she's going to do is she's going to have a wedding, and she's going to shove that wedding down everyone's throat.
And affirm her self-worth as a person. I think it's also interesting just in terms of almost affirming her femininity as well, and thinking about that intersection with gender expectations, and even more so in the early 2000s, I'm sure. The idea of being a young bride is so coveted for many people. So I can see all of these different reasons why she's placing so much value on the wedding. Not the marriage, of course, the wedding.
No, the wedding. It's all about the wedding.
All about the wedding.
She never even considers the marriage or the wedding as a marriage. The wedding is the wedding. The wedding and being a bride is the whole point for her.
I will say that even though she does, of course, embody some aspects of that bridezilla stereotype, I really appreciated an extra layer to that character of her financial independence and her investing and her saving and all that side of things. So it was very clear to me that if she wanted to, quote unquote, make it on her own, she absolutely could. And she has been doing that, at least from a financial point of view. She does have this fierce, almost secretive independence streak, which I did appreciate.
If anything, she thinks her house and her money is none of Agostino's business. It's none of his concern. And she knows that if he knew how capable she was or what she was doing, he would ruin it for her. He would become a problem. So she has him shunted off to the side. She even says to Claudia and Dulcina at one point when they go visit the house that she bought, that maybe she's basically saying that maybe she'll let him live there. It's her house. It's not their house. It's her home. She might not even end up living there. But I always said that Maritza is very smart, but not sophisticated. And she understands money, and she learned a lot from her bosses, her boss, Mr. Kim and Mrs. Kim, who she does see as parents almost. So I think it made the additions of her being financially very savvy came during the revision, because as I set aside my own prejudices for Maritza, like I found her the hardest character to connect. After I said to myself that her story is just as valid and probably even more illuminating than Dulcina's and Claudia's. She just came to life for me. And she just, as a very superficial person who is not insightful, I think she has a lot of layers. And part of that is, she also has a knack for investing in the stock market. Good for her.
Good for her.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, can I also confirm they're not actually married, are they? Because
no,
that wedding's not legal.
No, it's an elaborate costume party, is what.
Yeah.
And don't you wish? I mean, I wish some more women would have the guts to do that and just say, "I just want the party. I just want to wear the dress. I just want to do go through the whole motions of it." Because the guy probably isn't worth marrying. And you're probably better off not tying yourself. Getting divorced, I don't know how it is in Australia, getting divorced is complicated. Not only just emotionally, it's legally and financially very complicated. So why not just have that party?
You want to have a party? Have a party.
Yeah.
Have a party. She has to go through the motions of pretending she never pretends it's a marriage. Never. She just assumes that no one's going to ask, oh, have you gotten the license? Because who would be nuts enough to do that? Maritza.
Yeah.
And speaking of layers to the characters, one thing that we noticed through the story was how the sisters, particularly Maritza and Claudia, are very, I guess, aware of physical appearances, including judging others and themselves for the size of their bodies and their attractiveness. Why did you choose to sort of explicitly include these traits within the book?
It's definitely, I'm sure it's universal, but it's a very LA thing, a very Los Angeles thing, and for different reasons. Maritza has been accused of being fat phobic. It just was, and Maritza is not fat phobic. Maritza is lashing out and very childlike, very immature. So what she's fixating on is the weight of her fiance and her fiance's family. If they lived in a worse neighborhood than she did, and she lives in a pretty rough neighborhood with her parents, she would be bagging on them for that. What she fixates on is their weight, because that's just low-hanging fruit. So she's basically on the schoolyard being mean. That's what she is. She's not fat phobic. Claudia, it works on the west side of LA, which is it's a place where people are always looking to be looked at. So she's very aware that as an attractive woman who is not embarrassed about being attractive, is not embarrassed about being having a good body, and uses it to her advantage. And that's another way she controls. She's not only trying to control everything by keeping everything in order, she controls her body and her life through exercise. And that might be like, people think like, oh, that's great, you like to exercise, but there comes a point where you exercise too much and it's actually bad for you. So I think choosing for them to be having some sort of sense of being very focused on what they look like and what others look like, it was a very LA thing for me, and also a way to explore how they manifest their trauma and their coping mechanisms.
There were a few comments about how Claudia was too thin, or mostly coming from their mother, and that someone, I think it was Maritza, who was like, maybe she is anorexic, that I thought was an interesting frame as well for all the comments about other people's appearances.
It definitely threw me off the pregnancy reveal at the end.
Yeah.
We're well into spoiler territory, so I can say that. But, I was thinking like, what's happening? Has she developed an eating disorder? Is she having panic attacks, which is why she's throwing up all the time? Or is that part of the eating disorder? I had my psych hat on trying to figure out what was actually going on for her, as she wasn't explicitly saying what was happening through her story. So I will say that definitely threw me off. I was not expecting that.
Thank you. That for me was a trick. That was a really conscious decision on my part to hint that she had an eating disorder, especially in college. She was bulimic for a while, and she does acknowledge that she did throw up, and that's why she was refusing to throw up when she had morning sickness, because she didn't want to backtrack or trigger that. Yeah. And then Maritza does make a comment that Claudia always had a thing about her weight and eating. And I think, when you grow up in a chaotic family, and you have to have some sort of stability and sense of control, you control your body and you control what you eat. I think Claudia exercises a lot, and is very conscious of her body and very aware that she has to present a certain way physically, and honestly wants to present some way physically. But it was, for me, kind of hiding the pregnancy was because Claudia herself wasn't ready to acknowledge that she was pregnant. She really did come to terms with it, and that she had to make a decision and do something about it when the fire happened in her neighbor's house. And that's when she realized, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm avoiding. It's time to stop playing this little game with myself and take care of what I need to take care of, which for her was to schedule an abortion.
Yeah, it was a very clear turning point for her at that stage.
Speaking of Claudia, it seems to me sometimes the exercising is a way of avoiding her feelings as well. Because when I think she was doing hot yoga and she said, I'd rather do this than go to therapy. She speaks about, she speaks about having too much therapy. As therapists ourselves, we're always interested in how, book characters perceive therapy. What do you imagine Claudia would speak about with her therapist in their sessions?
For Claudia, therapy is an intellectual exercise. It's a way for her to think about her feelings without feeling her feelings. And that's why she's very, very good at therapy, but therapy, she hasn't allowed therapy to actually do its work up until the end, where she is she's safe enough to feel vulnerable. I think she would have been very clearer and careful about what she was talking about.
I'm sure.
Yes, and she might have. I don't think she would have disclosed the abuse. She would have disclosed enough to see it as a challenge, as if her therapist or psychiatrist, because she would see either and sometimes see both, and they have different takes. I think, right? Well, I know from experience they have different takes as how they approach things, to see if they would be able to figure it out. And when they wouldn't figure it out, she's like, obviously you're not smart enough for me, because I'm totally fooling you and wasting my time and my money. So even though she's a fan of therapy, I think she's gotten to a point where she realizes that she is not being fair to the process itself. And that's why she decides to do hot yoga, because for her, it's just as torturous and unpleasant and as much of a challenge as therapy.
I can imagine Claudia very much trying to take control of the narrative, not the narrative necessarily, but trying to take control of the conversation in the therapist's office and having control over that interaction, and not having too much vulnerability, maybe just enough so the therapist thinks that it's working, or, having that real, just having those walls up and intellectualizing everything rather than actually allowing herself to have any real breakthrough moments.
No, I think she knows what her problem is. She knows what the issue is. And she is trying to come to terms with the past by living in the present and ignoring the future. Because all of those things will change once she finally does come to terms with, something really terrible happened to me and my sisters. I have been trying to make up for it all my life. And I've gotten to a point where I have to take care of myself and choose myself. And how scary is that for somebody who is used to parenting, not only her sisters, but her parents too. And then when she realizes she is pregnant and she is in love with a man who is in love with her, what is she going to do? She's going to erase all of that. And that's her intention when she goes to have the abortion. And then she realizes she can't. She cannot do it again. She did that in her teens. She had an abortion in her teens, and that's never discussed as to how she was able to do that and who got her pregnant. And I have my own idea of who, and that was something that never came up because I didn't think I needed to explore it. But there's also trauma involving that, and she takes complete responsibility. She considered it her mess to clean up.
And that's on top of how she takes on other people's messes to clean up as well throughout the story. So
she must be exhausted.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was really heartbreaking that, Dooley talked about how they would always let Claudia go to the corner shop. That was,
honestly,
really
that made me cry when I read that. Reading those lines made me cry, because when you and Claudia and Dooley's admitting this from a place of compassion and empathy for not only her sisters but for herself, and acknowledges that she was a little girl What was she supposed to do? It wasn't her job to protect her sisters, but to have that kind of regret that you watch your sister put herself in harm's way to try and protect her and Maritza. I think that just, to me, is so devastating. And I wrote it, and I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, but when you, if you have friends and you have deep conversations and somebody admits just something so heartbreaking and you can still feel the pain that probably will never go away. That for me was that moment. It's just that's how damaging something like that is to a person, and some people never recover from it. Never.
How would you describe where the three sisters are in terms of their mindset by the end of the book? What have they learnt, and what might be coming up for them next? I
think they are in very good places. Honestly, I do. It's not a happy ending. It's an ending with hope. And Claudia is going to be with Ethan, and he is going to take care of her, and she's going to give him a hard time about that, but she is in a good place. Dooley is ready to finally be herself and experience her life and embrace what it has to bring, and be kind to herself and forgive herself. Maritza's Maritza. That's all you get. She's she's not going to change. She's not going to therapy. Maritza's going to continue to be Maritza, and that's okay because she has her sisters.
But if she does decide to leave Augustino, at least she's not legally bound to him, right?
Well, I can tell you right now, it's over between them.
Okay, so it is, it's definitely over.
They're done. She's done. She got the wedding. Yeah. What good is he now?
Yep.
Yeah. They're done.
She got to be a beautiful bride.
That's it. That's all she wanted. Next.
Yeah.
That's all she wanted.
There you go. All right. Well, I think that might end us up for today.
Thank you so much, Margo. That was really great.
Thank you. And if anyone, who's listening has any questions, feel free to reach out. I have a website. I'm on social media. So margocandela.com, everything's there. I also have a newsletter where I do get very chatty. So if people are wondering just how screwed up my life is, the newsletter definitely gives you some clues. And I would say if anyone decides to read the Neapolitan Sisters, I really, truly, truly appreciate the investment of your time and your money. And reviews are always welcome. I may not read them, but I do appreciate them.
All right, so that wraps us up for today. Thank you for listening, and a big thank you once again for Margo for joining us today. Remember to check out our show notes on our website for Margo's social media, newsletter, and her author recommendation.
If you like us, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on novelfeelings.com or on Instagram, Twitter, The Storygraph, and Goodreads via novel_feelings. You can also find my Bookstagram at paved-with-books with an extra S at the end.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today. Take care, everyone.
See ya!